China is going to take over the world, but not the way you might think. In this day and age, going to war with another country is no longer a possibility, so for decades, countries and governments have been trying to come up with ways they can gain control without conflict. In this video, we'll be discussing China's cunning plan which, if left unnoticed, will put them in charge sooner or later. The Soviet Union and the United States were the two superpowers vying for worldwide supremacy during the Cold War. The Soviet Union backed communism, whereas the US supported democracy and capitalism, making the two nations' political structures and ideologies very distinct. Even though the Soviet Union had a strong military and a major influence in world affairs, its economy started to deteriorate in the 1980s. The Soviet Union's economy was highly dependent on the export of natural resources like oil, gas, and minerals, but it did not diversify by making investments in industries like technology or consumer goods. The government also heavily invested in the military, further depleting the nation's financial reserves. This had a major effect on the standard of living for the average citizen. The infrastructure was in poor condition, and food and other necessities were nowhere near as much as required. As a result of these problems being ignored, healthcare and educational services also deteriorated in quality. In comparison, the American economy was more varied, booming, and heavily dependent on innovation and technology. There is now a larger group of highly trained workers who are better prepared to face upcoming challenges, thanks to the U.S.'s significant research and development expenditures. The consumer market was also booming, which increased the likelihood of company expansion and growth. These factors heavily contributed to the United States' technological and military supremacy, which ultimately won them the war. The Soviet military lagged behind because of a lack of money, whereas the U.S. military had access to the most modern equipment. This was especially apparent when both nations developed and accumulated nuclear weapons during the arms race. In the end, the U.S. was able to outspend and out-innovate the Soviet Union, which aided in the final demise of the Soviet political and economic systems. China has gathered from all of this that economic power is more important than military strength because the conflict will never be settled through military action. So, in the last few decades, the Chinese government started streamlining its economy and focusing on becoming the next center of world trade as quickly as possible. Who needs the military when you can strangle your enemy economically, huh? China's potential of being the greatest economic power in the world was quickly realized by the US, the current leader in the economy, and efforts were made to ensure China never gets close. One of the USA's biggest advantages was that China didn't have access to a deep-sea port. This had been a major obstacle to the country's economic development as it hindered its ability to transport goods to other countries and access important markets efficiently. A deep-sea port is a port that can accommodate large cargo ships that transport goods across the oceans. These ports are critical for countries that rely heavily on international trade as they allow for the efficient transportation of goods and provide access to global markets. China, despite having a long coastline, has very few deep-sea ports. Most of its ports are shallow and cannot accommodate large cargo ships, so China has had to rely on transshipment, which involves moving goods from smaller ships to larger ones at a hub port, typically in another country. Because they had to pay another nation to use the harbor, doing business in China became more expensive. This problem, however, would only hold China down for a while. China started acting like the nice guy, giving out massive loans to poor countries, which meant China now had friends. Poor countries are poor for a reason. It takes a lot of mismanagement for a country to lose balance, and many corrupt government officials are at the center of all the mismanagement. So when Sri Lanka owed China $7.4 billion by the end of 2022, it was clear that the Chinese knew Sri Lanka would never be able to pay this debt off before they even loaned it to them. Their eyes, all along, were not on Sri Lanka's money, but on its port. In 2017, the loan Sri Lanka had taken from China to develop the Hambantota port was paid back in the shape of the port itself. China now took control of the port for a lease of 99 years and had another hub for their trade to revolve around. China had successfully trapped Sri Lanka and forced it to give up its largest port. You'd think this tactic would not work a second time, seeing as the whole world saw what happened in Sri Lanka, but do not forget that it wasn't the Sri Lankan people who took the loan, it was a corrupt government. China's next problem was switching containers to smaller ships before shipping them to their port, which was too far away from Sri Lanka. China needed a closer, better port to make economic transport smoother. And this is where Pakistan came in. Another country with corrupt government officials who would sell their country's assets as long as they make their dime. So, despite knowing how the road ended, the Pakistani government accepted loans from China to develop the Gwadar port. The port is still under development, which means that China is still playing the good guy who is simply helping a poor country out. However, the paperwork and the exact wording of the deal made with China were hidden from the public, which could only mean one thing. The Pakistani government officials know what they're in for, but are still playing along because they stand to gain from all this. It's only a matter of time before China asks Pakistan to repay the debt, and since Pakistan will not be in a position to pay up, China will take over the port, giving China a deep-sea port as close to home as any of its other ports. For countries that are struggling to keep their economy afloat, loans from other, much stronger countries are the only way. So third world countries in Asia and the Middle East have little choice but to agree to the development China is promising in return for a 99-year lease. There are dozens of countries that are now in China's debt, and the USA can do nothing but try and offer better deals to these countries, most of which are not on the best of terms with the US after some of the military conflicts the Americans have had in the East. What the USA can control is its own economy. China may be growing stronger by the minute, but the game is nowhere near over. The USA is still the strongest economy in the world, with China a close second. The most interesting part is that even though China and the USA know they're competing to be the most powerful country, both of them are each other's largest import and export clients. That means that the largest part of the USA's import payments went to China and vice versa. So how can two enemies know they're enemies and still trade with each other? The two economies depend on each other very heavily. Look at it this way. The Chinese need whatever the US is selling to run the country, and the Americans need whatever China is exporting to be able to run theirs. So this is why the race is on. If a country is getting the majority of its imports from one country, what would happen if that country refuses to trade? Economic collapse. At this time, neither side can cut the other off, but if one of the two can manage to find alternate sources for the products they're buying from the other, they can inflict massive amounts of damage to the enemy's economy. This war has nothing to do with weapons, because both sides know that should it come to nuclear war, neither side would survive. Even though the US has superior military strength, that strength would mean nothing if China could outspend them. The race will be a long one, and allies will matter the most. China already has Russia and other enemies of the USA on its side, whereas the USA has better relations with many European countries. Strong trade with allies is going to be the tactic both sides apply, and we may even see them slowing each other down by funding each other's enemies. Do you think any of the third world countries around China can avoid falling into the debt trap? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next one.